Something you hear a lot is that there's no point in us doing anything here in the UK because our climate emissions are so small compared to places like China. If they're not doing anything, why should we?
What we're doing in this country is just a drop in the ocean compared to some of the bigger countries around the world who are constantly building new power stations, coal-filled power stations, and pumping out gases into the atmosphere.
China has more CO2 emissions than all the other countries in the world put together. If they're so worried about going green, tell China and India to stop.
What's the point of us reducing emissions now because China's building a new coal-fired power plant every week, which it pretty much is at the moment? The UK is held up as one of the countries that's made the most progress on climate, and it's absolutely the case. When you look at the total amount of CO2 that the UK emits today, it is much less than it was in the 1990s and certainly the 1980s or 70s. And that's a consequence of two things. One, we've gone from burning coal to generate electricity to burning gas and increasingly use wind power. But the other, we're a post-industrial society, so we don't really make many things anymore. Those large-scale industries we've kind of exported to places such as China. So China is the world's workshop. The interesting thing about China is that it is the world's leading coal user, but it's also the world's leading developer and deployer of renewables. So last year, China deployed more solar panels than the entire installed capacity in the United States. When you look at the total amount of CO2 produced by, let's say, China and the United Kingdom, China's is much, much larger. But you need to think about the total numbers of people in those populations, and China has a much, much larger population than the UK. So per person emissions, the UK is still actually larger than China. However, what we've been seeing over the last 10, 20 years is the emergence of the Chinese middle class, people who might be living in Shanghai and other urban centres, very affluent people, and their amount of emissions are pretty much on par with the emissions of the middle class in the UK. So it's not just a national problem, it's an international problem that's really linked to consumption. Generally speaking, the richer you are, the bigger your carbon footprint. The thing about climate change, it doesn't just matter about what the emissions are today, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years. The CO2 that we emitted at the start of the Industrial Revolution still has an effect, right? And because the UK led the world into the Industrial Revolution, we have a surprisingly disproportionate impact on the climate right now. So if you took a total cumulative emissions, the UK is still up there in the top 10.
People often point to China as a reason to, well, why should we have to reduce our emissions? Why would we look at countries necessarily? We could equally just look at corporations. Let's look at Apple, let's look at Amazon. These corporations have absolutely vast carbon budgets and carbon footprints and carbon impacts. But one reason we tend to look at countries is because then we can sort of push the problem away and say, well, you know, that's happening over there in China or in India or some other country that we can blame. Whereas if we look at corporations, they're often deeply woven into our own lives, so it's a bit harder to do that.
We've got the technology to do it, and we've got enough wealth and capability to do it. So really the UK should be leading the world into a greener revolution to demonstrate that it is possible. We can still have good quality of life at the same time as rapidly reducing our climate impacts.
China's emissions may be huge, but a lot of that is because they're making all the stuff that we're buying everywhere else in the world. If we're going to get on top of climate change, that will mean every country taking action. And shouldn't richer ones like us take the lead to show that it can be done?